If you'd like to explore how the story of your life intersects with your personal journey, the way that tale interacts with your community and the world around you, and change your life so the story you tell yourself matches the one that others see, I'd like to invite you to join me in the Storytelling for Personal Transformation class. Together we'll walk through the methods I've used during my own ongoing process of change, and pull on my more than a decade of experience helping people tell their story, while looking to pop culture, fiction, and mythology to see the connections between you, the world, and what you love. Enrollment is now open. Find out more at thepermaculturepodcast.com/storytelling. If you feel comfortable with your personal story, but would like to improve your design process or the way you communicate about what it is exactly that you do, I also offer one-on-one sessions in Storytelling for Design and Storytelling for Business. Contact me directly to share a little more about yourself and see if either of these programs would be a good fit for you. Email show@thepermaculturepodcast.com, or you can call or text 717-827-6266. Now through the end of October is the annual Summer to Fall fundraiser, and your support is vital in deciding if the Permaculture Podcast continues for another year. Give a one-time donation online at paypal.me/permaculturepodcast, by mail, Scott Mann, 210 East Fairfax Street, number 300, Falls Church, Virginia, 22046, or become a recurring supporter by joining the Permaculture Podcast Patreon community at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. This is the Permaculture Podcast. I'm Scott Mann. In today's interview, the first in a two-part series, my friend and colleague Dan Palmer of Making Permaculture Stronger gives me a sense of vicarious joy to share this conversation with you, as he's done something that's on my list of dream podcast experiences. Dan sits down face-to-face with David Holmgren at Meliadora, and together they talk about the early history of permaculture. From David's lips to our ears, we hear a first-hand account of his days at university, meeting Bill Mollison and their initial work together, to the impact of David's second permaculture mentor, Hakai Tane. Enjoy this conversation with Dan and David, and I'll join you again after.
Good to welcome you here.
And I'm very excited to be here with this microphone between us and to have this opportunity to have you share the story of your journey with permaculture design process over the decades, from when before permaculture was a thing till afterwards. And so I'm really excited to take our time and draw that out and make that more available, share that with others.
Yeah, and of course that's something we've worked on together in courses, our personal journeys with that. And certainly through those courses, that working together, that's sort of elicited for me, uncovered different aspects of understanding my own journey, through the lens of design process. I suppose, thinking about it in terms of childhood experiences, I was always a sort of a constructor, builder, making cubbies, constructing things, and yet never had any sort of family role models for that. My father wasn't particularly practical with tools, and yet I was always in what workshop there was in our suburban home as a young child. And so that thing of making things, imagining things which don't exist, and then bringing them to life was definitely part of childhood experience. Mm-hmm. I don't know particularly why in my last years of high school I had some vague notion that I might enrol in West Australian University in architecture. But I left to travel around Australia. I was hitchhiking mad in 1973, and in that process came across a lot of different ideas to do with the counterculture and alternative ways of living. But most significantly, I came across a course in Tasmania in Hobart called Environmental Design, and I met some of the students who were in it. And I'd realised by that stage that I was not cut out to do some sort of conventional university course of any type, that I was too radical and free in my thinking and wasn't wanting to be constrained within any sort of discipline or, accounting for things through, exam processes.
And what age were you at this?
So I was 18 at that time. And this course in environmental design really attracted me. It had a situation where undergraduate students who were doing a generalist degree in environmental design were sometimes working on projects with postgraduate students who were specialising in architecture, landscape architecture or urban planning. There was no fixed curriculum. There was no fixed timetable. Half the staff budget was for visiting lecturers and outside professionals. There was a self-assessment process at the end of each semester, which then led to a major study at the end of the 3-year generalist degree. And there was the same self-assessment process for the postgraduate thing. So you got up to the final finishing line and then had to show your results. And that was to a panel that included outside professionals that you had a say in choosing as well as the staff did.
Sounds suitably radical.
I believe it was the most radical experiment in tertiary education in Australia's history, set up by visionary Hobart architect Barry McNeill, who saw that there was no point teaching design professionals a specific set of skills because the world was changing so fast that by the time they came to practice, those skills could be irrelevant, and that you had to teach them more how to problem solve, how to think, and that they would find and develop the skills that were relevant through that way. So, that's what really led me back to Tasmania the following year to enrol in environmental design. But as part of that first year, I explored a lot of different aspects. I was actually doing the sort of backyard self-sufficiency thing in a rented house and was documenting the organic gardens, the compost making, the baking bread at home, all of that self-reliance that I would call retro suburbia now in a rented house was actually part of my study projects.
All right, yeah.
But I was also involved in projects with postgraduate planning students working with urban conservation activist groups trying to stop high-rise development in the historic Battery Point precinct and, setting up shopfront information for the community to explain planning law and, plot ratios of how big you can build a building for how much open space and all of those sorts of things. So ranged across quite a sort of a diverse interest area, and met a lot of people that had come to environmental design, if you like, as refugees from all the design courses around Australia. So it sort of gathered all the radicals at a time when most people went to university in the state where they lived, whereas more than half of the students in environmental design were from outside of Tasmania. And of course, the whole interest in ecology was a huge part of that and the crossover between ecology and design.
So that was a theme of the school?
Well, it was something that was identified as a huge area of interest of so many students, and at that time, so much so that they felt they needed to have an ecologist actually on the staff, because most of the staff, of course, were landscape architects, architects and planners. And I was actually on the selection panel as an undergraduate student for the person who ended up becoming my supervisor in the course. So that, was a context where came across a lot of radical ideas in design, but I also still felt, quite the outsider. And I can remember a particular seminar that was actually about the design of the Australian backyard. and people within the department were basically decrying how terrible, backyards were designed and front gardens and, people doing it themselves, how pathetic and hopeless it was. And I can remember being really outraged and getting up and on my soapbox and saying, look, this is one of the last things that Australians still do for themselves, is they design and create their own gardens and backyard spaces. Hardly any of them build their houses anymore. Are we a radical design school intending to extend design literacy and design capability as a universal literacy, or are we about commandeering, colonising another space, taking something else off people and professionalising it? So I have a strong memory of that being part of my early thinking about design, that design was a sort of a literacy that should be universal.
Well, that's exciting. Yeah, it's exciting for me to already hear, obviously, permaculture bells going off, because there was already that pre-existing overlap between ecology and design. And then when you bring the flavour of being in control of your own design processes and designing your own spaces, you're well on that trajectory already.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, at this stage, were you being presented with, it doesn't sound like it was that kind of school where they said, here's the design process you're all going to use for the rest of your careers, but were you getting a feel for a kind of an approach to design or a process at that stage, or was it still quite open?
Yeah, it was very free and open. And I suppose within the design professions, environmental design was either regarded as the best course in Australia because, it involved outside professionals. You had to do the postgraduate degree part-time and have a job in the field. So, there was a huge amount of practical reality that, was encouraging to design professionals, or other design professionals regarded as the worst course in Australia because people weren't required to actually sit at a drawing board or actually learn any particular thing, classic principles of architectural design or anything. But, I remember sort of being aware of, quite a strong interest in McHarg's ideas were, one of the ideas that was around. But there was also others that sort of involved design in perhaps a different way, like George McRoby, a colleague of E.F. Schumacher, famous for, of course, writing the book Small is Beautiful, which was published just a year before I started environmental design. He was there for 6 months teaching the whole intermediate technology notions of design in an appropriate technology suitable to scale, especially for developing countries, rather than just imposing large-scale systems that were inappropriate. So there was certainly different design contexts and also, design process, but certainly there was no clear didactic direction. The whole thing was a sort of a chaotic exploration. Really.
And you said you were documenting what you're doing in the rental with the compost making and everything. Were you also paying attention at that stage to, the process side of things, or?
Not so much. I think I was sort of quite, to some extent, outcome oriented, but, definitely grappling with that process of how you record your ideas and evolve ideas on paper rather than just literally starting something with your hands, which, is sort of how a lot of people do things in the most sort of rudimentary design process. So definitely that thinking through and documenting ideas and then sort of implementing those, but, pretty sort of, I suppose, limited investigations of the process. But it was in that first year that my interest really gravitated around food production and more broadly agriculture as humanity's prime way for providing for its needs, and looking at that crossover between if you like, landscape architecture primarily as a profession, you'd say, and ecology and how that applied to agriculture. And I could see the overlap between two, but not between the three. Mm-hmm. And it was at that sort of pivotal time that I met Bill Mollison. And he didn't strike me as a designer, and I don't think I was looking for that. I was very disappointed with the person who was chosen as the ecologist on staff. And
that you helped choose?
Oh, yes, well, I didn't get the person. That's another story as to who ended up and who it could have been, and other people who applied or whatever. But I suppose I'd already come to sort of view about a lot of biological science was highly reductionist, and that in fact, even within ecology, there was this tension between reductionist approaches, which would be regarded as sort of mainstream approaches to science, and the more holistic. So I was sort of very much looking for that. And when I met Bill Mollison through chance, he was at a seminar in environmental design. He wasn't running it. He was just someone who made some comments in it that I thought were really interesting. And, I went to speak to him afterwards, and suddenly this opened up of, this person thinks ecologically, holistically. And through a chance of him inviting me to come to his place, since I was looking for somewhere to live and I was also a bit disabled. I had a broken collarbone as a result of a motorbike accident, so I suppose it was sort of him taking in a homeless waif, you could say. We began a discussion about what I might focus on in the second year at environmental design. I mean, at the time, he was a lecturer in the psychology faculty, a senior tutor, actually. And so, the connection with design was sort of really not through him at all. And in a lot of ways, I didn't particularly, as I worked with him, see him primarily as a designer. Mm-hmm. I mean, an amazing polymath, genius, and primarily an ecological thinker.
And was he lecturing psychology at the same school?
No, at the older tertiary institution, the University of Tasmania, where I was at the new College of Advanced Education, as it was then called, where the environmental design school was. And
so, and you were saying you had this kind of hankering for a more holistic approach to ecology, and he was an example of that. So you were learning a lot from him early on, soaking that up?
Oh, enormously. So our relationship was very much student-mentor. And the seed of the permaculture idea sort of came in a discussion, towards the end of 74, and in him asking me, so knowing how free environmental design was, so what are you going to work on next year? What are you going to look at? And I said, that I'm interested in this crossover between these three things that don't seem to cross over at all.
And can I just clarify, you said you were clear how two of them overlapped. Was that the landscape architecture and ecology? But you weren't sure how the agriculture...
Yeah, I didn't see I saw overlap between ecology and agriculture.
Okay.
In agroecology ideas early, and organics. Organic farming was, although organic farming sort of began in the 1930s, it was really incorporating early ecological ideas in its reaction against industrial farming. So I could see crossover of any two of them,
I'm with you, yeah.
but not. I couldn't see anywhere where all three were brought together. Yeah. So the agroecology, for example, didn't seem to have much of a design focus. Certainly not a physical landscape layout, how do things relate in space. Mm-hmm. It was mostly concerned with agronomy, husbandry, those processes. And there was some crossover between landscape architecture and agriculture, but really as cosmetic design sort of overlay in some particular affluent parts, or the conservation of agriculture in a larger sense, like McHarg's work. Of, okay, where are we going to sort of protect agricultural land from inappropriate development and prevent sort of conflicts of different types of land use, the sort of whole zoning ideas, but that was sort of treating agriculture as a sort of a system that there was some sort of planning, design overlay, but not actually involved in the essence of agriculture itself.
And what did you talk about the overlap between design and landscape architecture and ecology?
Yeah, well, for example, one of my teachers in the course who had a lot of connection with Phil Simons, she was one of the first landscape architects in Australia to use in quite a few of her designs local indigenous species. Yeah. So that very strong crossover, that we had those early debates about, native versus exotic, in those years. So she was one of, the pioneers of that sort of thinking that was already there of how does landscape design create ecologies that, can support the diversity of nature and especially indigenous.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I haven't heard it quite that way before. It's so clear, and you had yourself a very juicy question.
Yeah.
Or a space of how would these things overlap that obviously influence the course of the rest of your life.
And so when I sort of put that to Mollison, that's what I want to work on. Of course, he had a million ideas and he said, okay, well, how about this for an idea? And he said, if most places on the planet, nature creates some sort of forest as an optimal ecosystem response to climate and geology and landscape to optimise production and diversity from a sort of an ecological point of view. Why doesn't our agriculture, if not look like a forest, literally, why doesn't it function like a forest? For example, why is it not dominated by perennial plants? Why is it dominated by annual plants? And I said, that is perfect. Yes, it's a design question, but it's fundamentally looking at the design that nature creates and why don't we appear to be using that in our prime activity on the planet, agriculture, by which we feed ourselves. I sort of regard that discussion as the seed of, the permaculture concept. And so I started sort of working on the permaculture ideas, when I started the next year in 75, and it basically consumed all my time, full time, and the staff were concerned that I wasn't doing anything else, but I was free to do that. And so Mollison and I were actually developing a permaculture garden at his property on the fringes of Hobart, 2.25 acre semi-rural property, about the same size as this place at Meliodora. And, it had forest on it and it had a history of, he'd owned it for some time and of course he'd defended it and saved it from the great 67 bushfires, not many years before I was there. And there was other people all around in that area who were developing self-reliance as part of, what we were on about, at that time. Yeah. And a lot of the interest initially in that was around what you would call economic botany, the exploration of useful plants from which we might, the components from which we might build permaculture systems, and especially obviously perennial plants and especially trees. So, there were a lot of elements that weren't primarily design process in that. Yeah. And in some ways, I have said, even though I was sort of a bit separated and critical from a lot of what I saw in the design professions and even in environmental design. And I was sort of off on this other tack, and, Mollison as my mentor, who was not really a designer, that in a way the design side of permaculture sort of in a way came more, I see, through the lineage of environmental design and the radical ideas of design that were part of that school.
And at this stage, in terms of it's a 1974 was a hell of a year.
2 years after the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report, 1 year after the first oil crisis that precipitated the Western world into the first economic recession. Of course, 1972 was also the election of the Whitlam government in Australia after 23 years of Conservative government, and a whole huge sort of cultural explosion of different ideas and different possibilities, which sort of led to the great constitutional crisis of 1975. And of course, it was the end of the long-running war in Vietnam and eventually the American defeat in Vietnam. Of course, Australia pulled the troops out in 72. So there was a huge sort of social and economic and political turmoil at that time, and an openness certainly in academia to sort of new radical ideas. So environmental design as that radical school ran from 1970 to 1980, and then it was basically emasculated, turned back into a conventional design course and moved from its Hobart base to Launceston.
Okay.
So it's very sort of emblematic of the 70s.
Mm-hmm. You got your timing right. It worked out well.
Yeah, the timing for permaculture, generally the huge interest there was in those sorts of ideas and, related ideas in science, for example, the whole embodied energy concept, how we use energy as a measure of human systems. In 1979, I went to the ANZAS conference in Hobart, and there were 5 papers on net energy analysis of agricultural systems. Move forward a decade, there would have been none of that. So there was a huge interest in all sorts of things that, included also design process. I mean, just as an example of that first year I was there, that project worked on with the Battery Point Urban Conservation. There was another project working as consultants to the State Department of Planning as to how to do for the first time a strategic plan for Hobart with community consultation. Because up to that point, planning had just been engineers and stuff deciding, where they imagine freeways are going to be built and new urban expansion and whatever. And so all of those ideas of people being involved in design process in things that affect them at that social level was, of course, part of that.
That was in
that period
in the atmosphere. And would you say that the period of, I guess, in a way, it sounds like that pivotal conversation about what you're going to do with your project next year was a kind of a moment, and then did that culminate with Permaculture 1, or what was the...
Yeah, well, I think in a lot of ways for me that did culminate in the publication of Permaculture 1 in 1978 and the huge interest that there was, whereas, for Mollison that was a stepping stone moving out of the university, giving up his tenured position and going to sort of spruik permaculture to the world, not just through the counterculture and the first areas of interest, but sort of more broadly and huge popularisation. Whereas I felt at that time not quite a fraud, but I didn't have the broad base of experience that Mollison had in so many areas, being a generation older me apart from anything else. So my interest was in building my practical skills, and I decided I definitely wasn't. In 76, I completed the environmental design degree. I didn't go back to do the postgraduate degree because I was actually at that stage so, I suppose, sick of or beyond wanting to think about things academically, and I wanted to do things with my hands. And initially, a lot of that, well, it already was happening as gardening, forestry, ecological hunting, but also a big role in building, and, built a big timber barn on a property that Mollison and I and others had bought and to develop as permaculture place. And then I worked with a friend of mine who was a builder who was my age and ran his own building business as his offsider. And we were doing, quite complex building projects and learning by doing. And really, for me, I didn't like the idea of design in whatever field disconnected from the practice of, if you like, implementation.
Yep.
That separation, it wasn't really viable. And apart from its sort of class implications of there's the designers, then the plotters who implement it, I didn't respect any of that sort of idea. So I was much more sort of interested in sort of doing stuff and building a skill base. But in that process, I went through several years, really, I suppose, beginning about 76, with starting to build a skill base for advising other people. So it was self-directed apprenticeship, really, working on other people's projects, some paid, some voluntary, doing the odd design consultancy. And then that led to my mother out of the blue buying in late middle age 180 acre rural bush property on the far south coast of New South Wales. And I thought I need to go and help her get set up and build a proper passive solar house and get gravity feed water supply systems and, appropriate fencing so she can have gardens and it be fire safe and in fact sort of implement all those ideas. So I'd been working at that stage, continuously from when I left environmental design at the end, graduated at the end of 76 to 79, those 3 years, I'd worked, incredibly in lots of different ways. But I'd also discovered my second mentor, really, in New Zealand, Hakai Tane, who sort of in a way I regard as my second mentor in permaculture. So I met Hakai at the Down to Earth festival organised by ex-Deputy Prime Minister Jim Cairns as part of the countercultural movement in Australia, the Down to Earth movement. After I'd been there at that festival with Bill Mollison, where there was this huge interest in permaculture, I hadn't seen Bill for quite a while, and we ran a workshop under a big shady tree that about 150 people came to. And anyway, I met Hakai after that workshop, and we wandered around this 1,000-acre grazing property, exploring things and looking, after he had given me a comment about something that Mollison had said that just made me sit up. He said, Mollison mentioned that this degraded grazing land needed gorse spread over it, which is, of course, a noxious weed. So it would improve the land, damaged by all the sheep overgrazing, typically sort of confrontational sort of thing. Hakai said, I'm not sure that I agree with Mollison about gorse and I thought, this is going to be a conventional argument about invasive exotic species. And he said, I think briar rose is a more appropriate species for this, which is, of course, another spiny, noxious weed. And, I thought, who is this guy? What does he know? And, we spent a whole lot of time looking around that landscape, and his knowledge in reading the landscape just fascinated me, and we spent days together. And he invited me back to New Zealand to help set up permaculture in New Zealand, the Permaculture Association of New Zealand. He was already a member of the Farm Forestry Association of New Zealand, the Soil Association, the Organic Organisation, and the Tree Crops Association. But he was actually trained in land law, so he had a legal degree, and planning and geography, and had studied at ANU, knew the Monero country very well, worked in British Columbia, but was really had adopted New Zealand as his sort of not just home, but sort of like spiritual home almost, and taken a name which was Japanese and Maori, but was originally Australian. And again, much older than me, but not as many years difference as with Mollison. So in working with Hakai in New Zealand in 1979, and then 79, and then again in 84, he taught me a lot about the whole land systems approach to understanding land. He'd actually done the land systems study for the New Zealand Lands Department in the high country, dry cold grazing country of the South Island. So mapping all of the land in a way that integrates the geology, the topography, the climate, and what he called the biophysical resources that express those underlying energetic and geologic forces in soils, plants and animals. And that was the basis of what we would call sustainable land use. You had to sort of have everything mapped onto those things, both at a large scale, but also down at a fine scale.
Can I ask, because I know you learned a lot of holistic ecology with Mollison, and I know you moved around the country a lot. And so what was the difference in reading landscape? Was it kind of like going deeper, or was it in a different direction? Or
look, I was already in that process of reading landscape, but in the early research for permaculture, because I would go and visit old forest arboreta and abandoned gardens, places where people had done stuff and then nature had sort of taken over. I found those much more interesting from a permaculture point of view, to give instruction as to what is this sort of intersection between humans doing stuff and nature doing stuff, than going to some pristine wilderness. So I was already developing those skills, and a lot of that was about ID. What is this tree? Where is it growing? Why is it there? Those sorts of things. So when I met Hakai, his mastery of that, and especially a deeper understanding of soil, not in the sense of the agronomists focusing on, what's the condition of the A1 horizon, the topsoil, but understanding the regolith, the deep structures underneath that often determine, the moisture availability and possibilities of deep nutrient mining and of different geological strata that would produce quite different ecosystems and had quite different potential to be developed and quite different vulnerabilities to land degradation processes.
Is that an actual word, regolith?
Yeah, that's describing the material underneath from which soils emerge, whether that's the bedrock or deep deposits of alluvial material. And in New Zealand, the newness of the country compared with Australia made all of those reading landscape skills so much sharper so much easier to see, whereas in Australia a lot of the processes are so subtle, so ancient, it's harder to see them. There was also understandings that Hakai convinced me that the sort of permaculture vision of broadacre integrated land uses of agriculture, horticulture, aquaculture, beekeeping, forestry, all of these things being integrated together couldn't come about under our freehold land tenure system. So that understanding, like from land law and from history of our ancestors before modern land title and the enclosures of the commons and all of those issues, learnt that, the way we own and control land is actually a huge factor in how it could be designed. So it was sort of drawing me into understanding those sort of cultural, institutional forces that shape design. But I suppose the most important really learnings with Hakai was clearly moving away from a sort of master plan, architectural, design it on paper and then implement it idea, which is always a bit problematic when that methodology was taken from designing a building to firstly trying to design a garden, because you're dealing with biological entities that change and a whole lot of complexities about soil that you don't fully understand, or shifting it to urban planning where cities are so big and complex that it's not sort of really possible for that to work. You could say, of course, that Christopher Alexander was very strongly critiquing that within architecture too, that it doesn't really work. And I was sort of vaguely aware of that critique because Alexander was one of the thinkers that was, influencing people in environmental design. But because my focus was more biological, I didn't sort of pick up so much on his work. But Hakai sort of really introduced the framework of strategic planning, which had sort of become a tool in the planning profession, but really came out of the military, as he explained it, where they had to act with limited knowledge and where they didn't control all the factors.
Yep.
And that idea of having frameworks of action, but you don't really know how that is going to express itself in final design form. And we started applying that to how does that strategic design process apply to what we call tree crop agriculture, or the interest of how do you not just have grazing animals around a landscape or annual crops, but these permanent long-lived structures of tree crop systems that were sort of a lot of our central focus, because like me, he was a tree crop nut. He was, obsessed with trees. And so, that application of that sort of design process was very much part of the learning from working with him.
This is really, really super fascinating. And you were saying earlier before you even met Hakai that one of the reasons after the origination of permaculture, where Mollison took off around the world and made it public, shared it, and you had that sense of wanting to get more hands-on skills and building skills, and you mentioned the you had a sense of that it wasn't viable to have a separation between, even if in some cases white-collar design and blue-collar implementation, but that was already an irk, and it sounds like
Hakai, very early on.
Yeah, that was already there, and then Hakai really helped you.
Yeah, because he was very sort of practical, hands-on, as well as working at this high-level consultancy to government and even business. But later on, he did a review of maybe it was before that time. He had a consultancy working for the state government of New South Wales to review the Sydney Basin regional plan, the whole of the Sydney metropolitan area. It had become a political hot potato internally, and they decided, unusually in those years, to get an outside consultant. And he somehow got the job, but in the process he went and lived in 5 different locations around Sydney, always travelled with taxi drivers, and sort of explored the multiple cities and spaces that Sydney really was, rather than the myopic view, as he said, of the planners sitting in the tower overlooking Hyde Park, that they had a view of the city and the suburbs. When he said already Parramatta was the largest retailing centre in Australia, and there were what he identified as 21 centres in Sydney that had city-level function. So he was an iconoclast in many different ways within the planning profession, but he was also a beekeeper and totally, hands-on person, that practical doing as well as, design and thinking.
Incidentally, I just had a flashback of there was a permaculture convergence in Sydney some years back. And it was pretty amazing because Hakai came and Bill Mollison was there.
Yes.
And you were there, and Peter Andrews was there from Natural Sequence Farming. And I remember Peter talking about how Hakai, I think early on, had actually helped him get started with natural sequence farming.
Yeah, well, I think the connection was that Hakai was asked by the bankers who were funding Andrews, and he was in financial difficulties, and that I think it was the bank, the Westpac Bank, asked Hakai to assess whether this guy's stuff had any validity, and he got to know Andrews really well, and he said, yeah, this is absolutely fundamental. And I remember Hakai telling me about it long before, Andrews became, better known. But they were 2 very strong characters, and not atypically they had a sort of falling out later. My understanding of that was actually that Hakai saw that Andrews' insights included a lot of Indigenous knowledge, and Hakai thought he should acknowledge that more strongly, because Hakai was very strong on that Indigenous knowledge, but he was also so challenging in thinking about all of those things as well. Yeah, so he was a sort of big influence on the whole design process. In 1979, he encouraged me to get a camera and record what I see in the landscape. So he sort of really put me on that lifelong journey of reading landscape. And I certainly, that began also how I applied that in my consultancy work of how do you look at landscape using the skills of reading landscape, but also then in trying to design in ways that is sensitive to not just the form of the land, but the actual different types of land, recognising that first.
Yep.
So using that land systems approach, which had mainly been used at a macro scale, bringing it down to a much smaller scale of permaculture sites to say, okay, where's the changes in the land, and understanding those first and mapping those before you start carving up the land into its uses or allocating it to different things.
And of course, you're well and truly into the domain of design process here, where a key part of it has to be deeply immersing in what's already there, what's happening, what are the land units.
So, I mean, the first really big project in applying that was my mother's property on the south coast of New South Wales, because it was 180 acres of forest. There were 12 different eucalypt species, had 3 gullies on it and boundary to a permanent creek, and 2 different geologies. And as I analysed it in a case study booklet that we produced on it called Permaculture in the Bush, it had 3 different land systems. And I sort of used that macro stand back from look at the big patterns first before going down into the details, looking across the landscape and saying, okay, where are potential house sites, identifying 5 of those and then checking them against different criteria. So I started, that sort of using ways of scoring things to come to complex decision making, where is rather than getting locked into single factor design, so a lot of those sort of processes. And it was also interesting as a design process for me in that I had the contour maps and I had photographs my mother had taken and I had her to interrogate, but I actually didn't get to the property for 6 months into the project. Because I was in Tasmania and then we were back in Western Australia selling the family home. And when we finally arrived at the land and drove down this bush track, I already knew what was around the corner from just going over contour maps and trying to get another bit of information. It was squeezing more information out of it. So it was a very sort of weird experience, but a very useful one in terms of design process to explore something that closely through indirect means and then, and then set up camp. And that very process of, no, don't make any assumptions. You've got a whole lot of stuff in your head. None of it means anything at the moment, So that process of how do you actually set up a basic camp and the first lesson about, don't set it up on the best spot because that could be where you're actually going to develop. So, there was also a huge number of practical learnings there in directing earthworks and directing other people's work in building a passive solar house. I worked a lot in that side, and I was actually really passionate about passive solar design. So ironically, that project was also quite a consolidation with me as, in practitioner terms, as an ecological builder more than an ecological farmer. It took me many years to sort of look back and say, well, actually, I've been more of a builder, and more of my design work has involved, if you like, a lot of the non-living elements, the infrastructure of earthworks and water supply systems and fencing and all that infrastructure, as well as with building. And, that knowledge base from the practical arts of woodworking and the processing of timber from tree to sawmilling, drying, processing, using timber was a greater development of skill in that area than I did with horticulture, let alone animal husbandry.
Oh, that's fascinating. And that sounds like that was that step from you're already very hands-on, done a lot of building and stuff, but to then be working with contractors as well, which is another step, and working indirectly through them or collaborating. Well,
it was mostly friends working at mates' rates, jack of all trades. So it was the beginning of that sort of artisanal sort of building process, and definitely doing a lot of thinking things through and planning on paper and then being prepared to change the design. And of course, when you are actually doing something yourself that you have gone to huge efforts to put on paper, but you see yourself as a learner and you are at the receiving end, it's very clear that you will change the design. Whereas when it is separated and there is someone invested with the authority of being the designer, and this person, the builder or someone further down the chain, is experiencing the disconnect between the design and reality, there's a power relationship, a whole lot of investment that it's hard to sort of bring that through, unless, of course, those designers very deliberately work in that way.
Yeah, it's almost like in that model, when there's a clash between reality and design, the native inclination is to try and make design win.
Yeah.
Which, of course, it ultimately cannot do. This is cool. I'd be really keen to hear about the transition into, because you talked about how you'd done some, it sounded like more informal consultancy back in Tasmania and going for the properties, but the transition into professional design consultancy, is that an appropriate thing to tell us about next?
Yeah, because really that project on the south coast in New South Wales was really the final or most important project that really led to me setting up Holmgren Design Services as a registered business in 1983, just a couple of years after completed the initial phase of development with my mother of the property, and also the documentation that I took to the first permaculture convergence in 1984 of a case study of that property. I presented two things. One was a paper on reading landscape, which I saw was trying to convey to the young permaculture movement, where people had already, there was 4 years of people having done the early permaculture design courses, rushing out as enthusiastic people trying to design the world, not necessarily making a very good job of that. And I was trying to sort of introduce the idea that the skill in reading landscape is one of the core skills for a permaculture designer, having to come onto a site where people don't necessarily have a deep multi-generational historic connection with the land, where there's not necessarily good mapping of soils or, even topography, even decent contour maps, and having to advise on design decisions and needing to be able to read a lot of things very quickly in the landscape. So there was that, and there was the case study, because I saw that there was a lot of the talk-to-do ratio in the permaculture movement felt to me quite high.
The talk-to-do ratio, yeah.
Yeah, that's what Hakai called it. He talked about how the talk-to-do ratio was higher in Australia than New Zealand.
Right.
Much higher in America, he said.
I've got to say, I had another flashback. At that time I met him in Sydney. When he got up to speak, he talked about the reason no one ever saw him is because he very rarely goes to convergences, because he prefers to be doing and minimise the talking. So he was walking his own talk there. Yeah,
so the case study documentation of places that had been permaculture designed and then implemented, rather than just things where people were saying, oh, there is something that illustrates permaculture ideas. Great. That's really good. But was permaculture actually influencing how that came about? Because that's the next test of the concept. Can people use these ideas to actually end up creating what are appropriate systems that reflect permaculture ethics and design principles?
Yes.
And so then to sort of document that design process and how that was sort of implemented. So I saw it as important as a sort of, at an ethical level, of being guinea pigs, of trying out your ideas yourself. That was all happening around that same time. And in 84, I also went back to New Zealand and worked with Hakai again, and through the New Zealand Tree Crops Association, working on this. How do these ideas apply to actually implementing the transformation of pastoral landscapes into multi-purpose tree crop dominated landscapes?
Would you be able to just say a brief word? I know you've talked to me in the past about how you grew up in a very free-thinking, kind of rational, intellectual household, and you've told me a few stories over the years about how during your time with Hakai, he bought, he'd give you spontaneous lectures about Lao-Tzu, and he brought a sort of Eastern mysticism flavour. Did that have any impact or bearing or relevance to design process?
Well, actually, that reminds me, yes, of a story I have told a few times. I suppose I would see myself growing up as a super rationalist. Even as a child, I would wake up and not remember any of my dreams, probably because the dream world was like just too inconsistent with reality. And there were a few things that broke down that process. The primary one was the experience of LSD made it clear to me there were more things in the human mind that could possibly be comprehended through simple sort of reductionist methods. But another marker in that was certainly working with Hakai, setting up this site for these workshops over Easter in 1979 on a high country grazing property. And we were looking at, okay, where are people going to park? Where's the sort of the camp kitchen going to be? Where's the sauna by the stream? And, just designing a sort of a small festival space. Mm-hmm. And both of us as designers, just running through all the factors and, like, oh yeah, but what about this? And then, the circulation here, or, like, what if that's wet and etc. Anyway, we got to a sort of a bit of a stumbling point where there was this one option over here and one there. And we'd sort of run through a few of the factors. And Hakai said, oh, this is a case for the coin, and pulls out a coin and flips it heads, tails. And I was like flabbergasted, on this idea that you could actually make a design decision based on the flip of a coin. And then he sort of gave me this lecture about the I Ching and a whole lot of ideas in Eastern mysticism about, firstly, connecting to what at a deeper level, your feelings about what is the right thing. And part of it is your reaction to the chance decision, but also that, you uncover some sort of, different way of accessing part of understanding. Mm-hmm. So that was, one of the stepping stones in that sort of breakdown of that super rationalist control. Another one was actually when I was working with my mother on developing the property, the early stages of the design, and we'd identified where the house site is going to be on this 180 acres and looking at gravity feed, water supply, dam site options, all sorts of different factors. And it was all sort of fairly thick regrowth, logged over bush site that we'd chosen. So it actually involved clearing quite a lot of trees and a lot of thick regrowth. And I'd been working through with my inclinometer, looking at tree heights and, because you're talking about forest trees that were 35 metres tall. And okay, how are we going to make the clearing, minimising and retention of trees that want to keep and get full sun access into the passive solar building and full winter sun access to gardens. And you're trying to do that through thick young regrowth and big emergent trees. And I'm sort of using the inclinometer, looking up at tree canopies, sun angles, working backwards and forwards. And this is over a period of more than a week wandering around in the bush. And in the meantime, my mother had wandered in and found this old box that had been left with some rubbish. And she stood up and she said, I reckon the house should be about there. And as I worked around, I ended up coming back to where the box was. Now, it may have been sort of completely dumb luck, but, it was that sort of, finally that rational evidence-based process actually somehow connecting with something that came completely intuitively.
Mm-hmm. And that was David Holmgren, interviewed by Dan Palmer. Find out more about the development of David's demonstration site and other work at meliadora.com. Dan is at makingpermaculturestronger.net. Together they're working on a film project called Reading Landscape. You can find out more about the film and donate to that project at readinglandscape.org. As this episode goes live at the end of July 2021, they've raised $11,000 of the $35,000 goal, with another month left in the campaign. I don't just share that with you as a link to follow, however, I also donated to this campaign, as it's something I believe we need, now more than ever. You'll of course find links to all that and more in the resource section of the show notes. There I'll also link to my earlier interviews with David Holmgren. If you give those a listen, you can get a sense of the importance of bringing different voices into the mix. Even when it comes to sitting down and interviewing the same person, each conversation and what we can learn is truly unique. That's also why I invite anyone, including you, to reach out to me if you'd like to record a conversation and share it with me for consideration to include as an episode of the Permaculture Podcast. You can also get in touch if you'd like to discuss starting your own show. I'm more than happy to have the conversation. Call or text 717-827-6266. Email show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. If you'd like to take the slow road and correspond by post, I always enjoy receiving your letters. That address is Scott Mann, 210 East Fairfax Street, number 300, Falls Church, Virginia, 22046. I'll join you again in a week or two with the second part of this conversation between David Holmgren and Dan Palmer. Until the next time our paths cross, spend each day considering your design journey and own unique story while taking care of Earth, yourself, and each other. Each other. Each other. Each other. Each other. Each other. Each other.